Does me sitting here affect?
No, no, it doesn't do anything at all. We're fine. Thanks for asking. We're in good shape. Okay, so we are in the romantic history of Islam. The Khulafa Rashidin. Who are the Khulafa Rashidin? What's that in English? Right-guided caliphs, 4 Orthodox Sunni caliphs. Most Sunnis think they are the caliphs, but the Shiites don't agree that those are the caliphs. Someone said, when did the split between Sunnism and Shiism begin? Right from the start, right from the death of the Prophet. It didn't crystallize and coalesce into the form we finally have it, but that's when it began, over the issue of succession to the Prophet. All recognized the Prophet, but not all recognized who succeeded him, who the legitimate heir was, who the legitimate successor should be, and those who did succeed were not considered by everyone to be legitimately recognized. Abu Bakr, because of the favored position of his daughter Aisha. Omar, objected strenuously to by the partisans of Ali. Uthman, considered corrupt by those who objected to him and his ties to the previous Meccan aristocracy. Ali, well, everyone supported Ali except his enemies, who we seem to have had a legion of. And so we heard that Ali was ultimately assassinated by a Hariji, a disaffected Hariji in his own camp, after he had agreed to arbitration with the Umayyads over the issue of the bloody shirt of Uthman. The bloody shirt of Uthman, Muawiyah's claim in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, which was his center of political activity, to ask for, maybe really or not, justice for those who had assassinated his kinsman, Uthman being a kinsman of Muawiyah. Now, after Ali was assassinated, as we said, Muawiyah's forces proclaimed him caliph, and we had a very successful caliphate, good or bad. And that is the Arab caliphate, the Umayyad caliphate in Damascus, the first strong representative of which was Muawiyah. He went on from 660 to 680. After he died, his son Yazid thought to take over. Yazid only outlived his father by 3 years. He died in 683. And there were no successors after that. So someone who was a relative of theirs in the configuration of forces was really Yazid's Secretary of State anyway. His name was Marwan. He was a cousin, and he was in the government. He succeeded to the control of things. I don't know if he actually became caliph or not, but the sons of Marwan became the heirs of the Umayyad Caliphate. And 4 sons of Marwan became caliphs, one after the other, on up through the conquest of Spain. The most famous son of Marwan was Abdul Malik, but there was also Al-Walid, under whom the conquest of Spain was undertaken, so on. So these were actually known as, under the Umayyad rubric, Marwanids. Now I told you, when Yazid became caliph in 680, Yazid, named after Muawiyah's fallen brother in the original campaigns north under Khalid ibn al-Walid, in which Muawiyah was a standard bearer for his brother as a young man in the army. Obviously, he named his son for the fallen brother. Yazid didn't last long, but at Yazid's takeover, the Ali contingent in Medina felt it was the right time to make further Alid claims for the succession, because Ali had been badly done by and, in fact, assassinated. Ali was not assassinated by a Umayyad, a representative or a sympathizer. They had caused a lot of the trouble. They caused the upset. They actually undermined Ali's reign as caliph from 656 to 661. But the assassination was a disenchanted person within Ali's own camp, a Haraji. And what did we say? It doesn't mean a horrible, but a Haraji. What's a Haraji? What did we say, a Haraji? What's the Arabic root of that? What's it come from? You Arabic-speaking people, Haraja, what's that mean in Arabic? You know. You don't speak Arabic? Well, who speaks Arabic in this contingent of believers that we have in the class? Who's in Arabic? You read it, who speaks it? Only me? And I speak a terrible Arabic. What's Haraja mean? Haraja. What's that verb? To go out. Right. Yeah, good. Leave. Go out. That's right. Thank you. What's to come in? Huh? Yeah. So Haraja means to go out. The Harajis went out. Who did they go out from? Ali's camp. Why did they go out? Because they disagreed with his decision to negotiate with Amr ibn al-As and Muawiyah over the situation from emanating out of the Battle of Siffin, where the Muawiyah camp put Korans on their lances, right? So all that you should recall from what we did last time, and the time before. So the Harajis, Ali made war against them. The Harajis felt it was permissible to make war on fellow Muslims. That was fairly unheard of at that point. And the reason it was permissible to make a war on fellow Muslims, because a fellow Muslim was no longer a Muslim when he did things that were against the command of God. It's a very convenient definition. He had apostated himself. To be an apostate in English, apostasy means to leave something in a sectarian or heretical way or whatever. You become an apostate, you become a non-believer, you become an outsider. You apostatize yourself. They had apostated themselves in their decision to make accommodations with bad Muslims like the Umayyads. These people were very extreme. They're like today. In fact, I don't see any difference, as I told you, between Harajis and Bin Laden groups. They're exactly the same. So nothing has changed in these areas of Islam. And if you were, that's why I think these courses are good. If you were a student of Islamic history, you would understand all these movements very clearly. They wouldn't be surprising to you at all. The Harajis hung out in the far reaches of the empire, just like we're having now in the far reaches of the Islamic world. And all of us have to invite me down to Washington, and I clue them in on all this stuff. But they never did, and they never have, and so they keep on stumbling because they don't know anything. But nothing would be surprising if you just knew anything about the history of Islam. You would know what a Shiite was, you would know what a Sunni is, you would know that there's very little common ground in the end, and that these things are not going to be reconcilable, and so on and so forth. Lots of things you would know. But these people love to go into situations blindly, and they reap the rewards. 2,000 dead Americans who, unfortunately, were not properly prepared for the situation that they were forced to face. And it's very sad in a way, because I told you I'm not against the enterprise of constitutional democracy in any part of the world. But it seems to me you have to go in with some understanding of what you're going to face. never mind, that's neither here nor there. The point being that Harajis existed then and they exist today. And bin Laden and his group of people, and they think it's permissible to make war on fellow Muslims who are bad Muslims. That's normal for them, and that's what Harajis felt. Now, normal Muslims at that time didn't think it was permissible to make war on fellow Muslims, good or bad. They didn't think that a bad Muslim had apostated him or herself just because he wasn't a good Muslim. But that was their view, and that's the ideological underpinning that why it was permitted to kill fellow Muslims. And this was pretty new. Of course, Ali didn't approve of that, and he made war against them, and he suppressed them. Then they fled out to the outer parts of the Islamic world. But some of them who had been injured in the fighting and had lost dear, you know, someone is always injured in fighting, and someone always has a bad feeling, a grudge about the fighting, who had lost dear ones, blamed Ali and assassinated. That's the official story. I don't see anything to really feel that that's wrong. And as I told you before, there are moments in history that are really important. If Ali's descendant, Hassan and Hussein, had waited till 683 when Yazid died and there were no heirs, the situation that the Marwanids took over from would have been much less clear, and I think that the Alids would have had a much better chance of reasserting themselves. You see what I mean? So 3 years there made all the difference. If they waited 3 years, everything probably would have been different in the Islamic world. But as it was, the partisans of Hussein did go under promises from southern Iraq. Is southern Iraq Shiite today? Yes. Southern Iraq was already Shiite sympathetic back then, and invited them from Medina to come to southern Iraq. And they were caught by the Umayyad police near this town that we presently call Karbala. And they were butchered there. Some 70 or so partisans and family members of Hussein. And that then becomes part of the Shiite grievance. Not only vengeance for Ali, but vengeance for his son Hussein. So we have two imams murdered. And that creates this whole ethos of feeling of being badly done by, wanting vengeance, potential terrorist organizations. I was looking at the history of the Crusades, badly done as it might be, on the History Channel the other night. And they were talking about the Third Crusade and about Salah ad-Din's difficulties with a guy called Nur ad-Din in northern Syria in a town called Aleppo, Al-Halab in Arab parlance. And it was said that Nur ad-Din started sending out assassins to assassinate his political enemies. And these people were called Hashashiyun, which is where we get the name assassin from, Hashash, Hashish, meaning grass man. And that's because they were supposed to have taken hashish, before they worked themselves into a mood to kill them, be killed in the process. I don't think we need that these days, but that's where the English word assassin comes from, the Crusades. And this is almost endemic in Shiism in that period, feeling that, you know, badly done by, and therefore Shiite, you know, groups like Hezbollah, even today, for instance, in southern Lebanon and elsewhere, feeling badly done by, and people being willing to commit political murder and stuff like that. And that was already going on 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago. I guess we're talking about 1,300 years ago. So this is nothing new. This has actually been going on from the beginning. It maybe is quiescent for a long period of time, then it starts up again. So these curves are there, and of course the period I'm talking about, the Crusades, is only 1,000 years ago, or maybe 900 years ago, so maybe that's not 1,300 years ago. But the Shiite feeling of being angry at the outside world for having gotten a raw deal, as it were, persists through all of Shiite feeling, and it persists in Iran today. And you're not going to conciliate Shiite Iran. You could conciliate Shah Iran, who wanted to be Western and wanted to, invest in a Western way, but you're not going to conciliate Shiite Islam. Because they have and the Ayatollah Khomeini is a perfect representative, they have a feeling going from way back of being gotten the bad end of the stick, being poorly done by, and a grievance, a feeling of grievance. That will persist. That will persist. That will persist 50 years from now, 100 years from now. It's in the fabric of the culture. Now, you don't see this among Sunnis. And I can always tell when a Sunni speaks to me and Shia, I know immediately from their mental state, which they are without their even telling me. In the Shiite, it's always a feeling there's a grievance that is behind things. And that grievance it expresses itself in that Ashura ceremony I told you about, where they go and celebrate young men, flagellate themselves, hit the top of their head so blood comes out, or flagellate their back, or whatever. How many have seen pictures of these Ashura flagellations? Yeah, you should. Have you actually seen it in person?
No, but I knew some people who were Shia in my former country.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they're quite, I don't say they're quite fearsome. I don't think they're ferocious. They're just like, you see the power of it.
Well, they just believe that if they hit themselves, if they hurt them, then they will be forgiven in afterlife.
Yeah, but it's not just that. The point of seeing the thing, another person seeing it, I mean, it's quite fearsome to see it. People with blood streaming down, wanting to hurt themselves. In commemoration, it's a yearly commemoration, and it's very striking, and will make an impression on whoever's watching, the people there, people far away, and so on. And that's part of Shiism. It's not in Sunnism at all. It doesn't exist in Sunnism. It's only Shia. We'll talk about different kinds of Shiites in due course. Let's go on with the history. So the conquering under Yazid, Muawiyah, and so on picked up a pace. They got as far as Morocco. The new sons of Marwan emperors came into play in the early 700s. I think Al-Walid is the most is the original one. He may be the oldest son. I'm not sure. You can check on these 3 or 4 brothers succeed each other in turn. The Umayyad dynasty is centered in Damascus. It lasts till what date? Well, it's an easy date to remember, 747, just like the airplane. So, but it dribbles on to the 750 period. But it continues in Spain for another 300 years after that. That's the end of it in Damascus. Well, so the conquest of Spain is important. So let's look at the conquest of Spain. In around 710 or thereabouts, the situation across North Africa had been pacified. The Berbers had come into Islam. The Muslim armies under the Umayyads had reached as far as Morocco in the west and India in the east. Very successful conquest. They hadn't finished with the Byzantines in Byzantium. They had taken to the sea, though. They had had several attacks on Byzantium itself, not successful ones. But they had become a sea power, and they controlled all of North Africa. A very rapid expansion. If you think of that expansion, starting with the death of the Prophet in 632 to 710, what are you talking about? 70 years? To have expanded to that extent in 70 years is quite an amazing accomplishment. They filled lots of power vacuums. The Persian Empire just collapsed after the Battle of Qasadiya. It just totally there was no Persian Empire anymore, and any Persian nationalist feelings began to re-express themselves in Shiism, as we'll see. The Byzantine Empire was another story. It didn't collapse. It retreated to the northern part of the Mediterranean. It retreated into Asia Minor, which ultimately became Turkey. Byzantium didn't fall to the Turks till what year? (1453). I mean, the Byzantine Empire was going to last another 700 years, regardless of the blows that it took. And it was the Crusaders, actually, that weakened it, because if was the Crusaders going to the Crusades from the Latin Christian areas in Italy and Germany and France and those places that stopped off, encouraged by the Byzantine Emperor to continue because of the lands that he'd lost in Syria, that decided they didn't want to go on to Palestine. It was too hard. Let's sack Byzantium. Instead, we can make more money sacking Byzantium than we can going and sacking Jerusalem. And that's what they did in the Fourth Crusade. And they weakened, that was around 1200, they weakened Byzantium really critically, fatally almost. Took 200 more years for it to collapse, but the sacking of Byzantium by the Crusaders was the real death knell of the Byzantine Empire, not what the Turks did. A lot of people don't know. And who was behind pushing the Crusaders to do that to the Byzantines? Who was taking the Crusaders east on their journey if they didn't march through overland? How would they get there? Venetian boats. The Venetians had slowly become a mercantile trading power, which is why, how many have been to Venice? You go into St. Mark's Square, there's all these beautiful monuments from the power of their trading successes. They were in competition with the Byzantine traders and others, and they took the Crusaders there, and they felt in competition with the Byzantine traders, and they encouraged the Crusaders to sack Byzantium for their own interests of their powerful economic control over the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the Venetians who wanted to supplant the Byzantines that encouraged them to encourage the Crusaders to do what they did in the mid-1200s. Anyway, we're getting ahead of way ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. So they'd reached Morocco in the early 700s, and India likewise. And then this governor, as we said, in Morocco, his name was Musa ibn Nusayr. Some people said he was of Jewish background originally. I don't know if he was or he wasn't, because of his name Musa, who knows. And then his freedman, Berber freedman Tariq, were the two involved in the campaigning. As I told you, Gibraltar is named after them. They jumped off. I recently saw a History Channel. I watch all this junk. I guess you guys don't. I saw a History Channel thing on the conquest of Spain. It was pretty accurate. It was fairly well done. It showed that the Visigoths, who had gone into Spain early, because the Romans had bought them off. You know, Rome was sacked several times by the Visigoths, but before them, the Vandals. Several groups attacked Rome in the 300s to the 400s. And, you know, the Latin Roman Empire began to collapse around that time, whereas the Byzantium did not, funnily enough. Well, the Romans would often buy groups off. I think the Visigoths under Alaric, 425, sacked Rome and were then bought off and sent on into Spain. But in the process, they were Christianized, and as all new Christians, by the 500s, they became very enthusiastic. So they met a Spain that was more, you know, live and let live sort of place. But in their takeover of Spain, they became extremely aggressive and imposed a lot of onerous legislation on the Spanish populace vis-a-vis Christianity, because they were at that time become new converts and were very enthusiastic. So Jews were, a whole series of anti-Jewish laws were passed and things of that kind. There's a whole codex of the legislation from the 500s that can be looked at should anyone be interested. So this is the 600s too. So in that period, the situation in Spain became very troubled. And the Muslims from the Berbers and others obviously heard about this and realized that Spain was a real possibility, even though it was on the northern side of the Mediterranean. So Tariq was deputized by Ibn Nusayr to lead the campaign, and he didn't find much resistance. And the Muslim armies swept through Spain very easily because of the dissension there, because of the Visigothic king, Roderick, was not very popular among his subjects, and there were a lot of disillusioned subjects, and also Jews. And the rumors and the way a lot of people presented it is that as the Muslim armies advanced, because they didn't have huge armies, through Spain, they couldn't govern the place, they left Jewish governors behind in the towns behind them to govern the towns that they had conquered. So the Jews, to some extent, and the Muslims cooperated in the conquest of Spain in that regard. The Jews weren't the fighting people, but they were involved in administration to some extent. Which is why when the Spanish reconquered the place, 700 years later, their animosity turned against both Jews and Muslims, and they expelled both groups from Spain in 1492, the year Columbus set off for America. Columbus's voyages to America in 1492 were directly connected to the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from Spain, and the institution in the process of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was instituted in Spain to ferret out false Christians, Jews and Muslims who were lukewarm Christians who had converted because they were forced to, but were not really believers. And then the Inquisition was exported to the Americas to be applied to Indians and other people, unfortunately. But that was the original reason for the Inquisition, and so we're talking about 700 years later, Ferdinand and Isabella, the people that sponsored Columbus, and you may know about, they sponsored him because it was a commemoration of their unification of all of Spain. They had finally finished with the last Spanish Muslim principality, the principality around Granada, which had survived up until that time. And they expelled all of those, conquered that area, expelled all of the Jews, and in the process sponsored Columbus's trip to America, where a lot of these refugees were hoping to find shelter, and some of them did. A lot of Columbus's crew were the Jews, and his doctor and some of the other people on the crew. And some people say that Columbus himself was a pseudo-crypto-Jew, although I don't think he was. But that's, no one knows. His background is clouded in mystery. Nobody knows where he came from, who he was, what was he doing in Spanish service, and so on. I think it's been proved recently that he's actually with a Catalan family from northern Spain. But anyway, short of doing DNA tests, I'm sure no one will ever know the truth about Columbus. But let's go back to, that goes back to the troubled situation in 700. It took the Christians 700, 800 years to reconquer Spain. But they did. That's how serious the fighting in Spain really was. A 700, 800 year struggle. Anyway, the Muslim armies were personally quite successful. And I'll draw my poor map of Spain here. Here's Spain. So here's Gibraltar here. So they came up and they absolutely went, like this. But they didn't ever conquer that area. They went bypast it. And this was an area where Christianity remained. I forget what the name of that area is. I think it's called Galicia. There's another place here called Extremadura in Spain, in Spanish language, very hard. I don't know if that was conquered or not, but those areas were bypassed. And you can say that was a mistake the Muslim armies did, because as things settled down in Spain and those areas coalesced, the Reconquista was launched from those areas with Church Vatican help from Italy and Rome. In any case, originally the conquest went fast, as I told you. The administration was as it was. Tariq was successful at the beginning. Musa became jealous of him and fired him because he was getting all the glory, and Musa, who had initiated it as governor of North Africa, was getting none. And as I told you, then the caliph back in Damascus got jealous of Musa because he was getting too much glory and riches, and recalled him and took all his wealth away from him when he came back to Damascus. And I think it was legended that Musa died a beggar on the streets of Damascus, or something close to a beggar. Usually, I don't know if he was treated this way. You'll have to check me out. My memory is going a bit dim, but it's probably not as bad as some of your memories. Since you don't even know about these things, probably most of you, but they often put people's eyes out to make them helpless, not a threat anymore. They didn't want to kill them, they would just blind them. I'm not sure if Musa was treated this way, but I have a dim recollection that he was. this was the gratitude he got from the caliph for all his conquests. In any case, he was recalled, and all of his wealth went to others and so on, even though he brought a lot of wealth back to Damascus. The problem with the conquest, as I told you already, it was so fast that to administer such an empire was almost impossible, really difficult. And by the 800s, things started to break down, as I will show you. And the administration was not, you didn't have the communications, radio, roads, things like that. It would take, what would it take to ride a horse from Spain to Damascus? I mean, it probably could take you like 6 weeks or something if you were lucky, maybe 3 months or something. I don't know how long it would take. So it was really almost impossible to administer an empire of that consequence. I should deal, before I go back to the fall of the Umayyad Empire, these were its most famous conquests, Spain. By the way, and in the conquest of Spain, a lot of Arab tribesmen followed the armies. So a lot of tribes from northern and southern Arabia followed the armies, and this northern Arabian, southern Arabian tribal ethos actually moved into Spain. So there were towns in Spain that were settled by tribes with a southern Arabian loyalty and a northern Arabian loyalty. Remember we read that thing about the bird's nest? Ultimately that was the Kais versus Kal tribal feud that started, according to the writers, over a bird's nest. So these Kais-Kal animosities, I'm a Kais, you're a Kal, I'm a southerner, you're a northerner, Kal being the southerners, Kais being the northerners, actually divided the settlers in Spain too. So there'd be certain towns that would be Kais, certain towns that would be Kal. Some towns, Almeria for instance, would be maybe Transjordan settlers. I'm not sure, you could check out the actors. You can read the Spanish histories. Northern Arabian settlers would go to a different Spanish town, Palestinian ones, Syrian ones would go to a different one. And these towns in Spain all became part of this tribal situation from the Arabian, Northern Arabia, and the areas in Jordan and Syria. And they brought their animosities with them there in terms of which governors they supported, which they did not. Governors were assassinated, the struggles were going on almost from the beginning. And in the Umayyad family itself, depending on who a given caliph married and who was his favorite wife among his harem or whatever, some would be Kai, some would be Kal, some would have Kai sympathies, some Kal sympathies, and that undermined to some extent the Umayyad dynasty. Now this is very complicated, it would have to be a much more serious history course than we're just giving a sketch here. But that's part of the Umayyad tribal ethos. I told you before, the Umayyads, you see right from the get-go, the Kharijis thought Ali was a bad Muslim for negotiating with them. What did the Kharijis think of the Umayyads? Well, they didn't even think they were Muslims at all. And, there were Muslims upon Muslims upon Muslims, good Muslims and bad Muslims. Pious Muslims of the kind you might get today in Indonesia or Malaysia or Pakistan, and bad Muslims of the kind you might go, the ones that like Ali Khan, that go to the Riviera or something and gamble and drive racing cars and drink alcohol and enjoy all the corrupted Western pleasures that are often associated with being a playboy. Princess Diana's boyfriend, I don't think he would have been considered a very good Muslim. He liked fast cars, drinking, yachts, stuff like that. He was not interested in prayer. So, you have good Muslims, you have bad Muslims, but you don't make war on them unless you're a Khariji-minded person, extremist. Which is what's happening in the Muslim world today, because the lukewarm Muslims, or the average person, they don't make war on anybody, they just want to live. But if there's a group of people who are prepared to make war on others, they can intimidate the others. And the others don't have the wherewithal or the force of character or even the ability to resist. So they crumble under the assault of that kind of thing. Take the Palestine problem. I don't want to get into political things, but I think the Palestine problem could easily have been solved decades ago by people of goodwill on both sides. If it hadn't degenerated into the kind of violence we now see, and one side blaming the other, and then grudges and blood feuds and whatever grievances, real or imagined, develop. So now the solution is almost impossible. Meanwhile, the economy collapses. Nobody can make a living. There's nobody working in Gaza, and so on and so forth. And so the whole thing becomes worse and worse and worse and worse. I'm not saying what the good or bad reason is. So, when you get committed people who are prepared to intimidate other people, the other people really often don't have the ability to resist that. So the real deep believer has a huge advantage over the average sort of just a person who's trying to muddle through. And I think we're seeing that in Baghdad today. That's the same kind of thing. The people who have a real commitment can totally overwhelm the people who are just trying to get on with their lives. And I don't have the answer for that. I'm saying that's something to always think about when you have this situation of committed people versus just average people who may or may not have a big commitment to anything. Just live their lives as best they can. Anyway, so the Umayyad Caliphate was looked upon as an Arab Caliphate. Umayyad Caliphs were looked upon like Arab tribal kings or chieftains, not like real caliphs, not real successors. And the animosity grew in places like Medina rather intensely. Particularly among Alid people who thought they had been badly done by, but also the forces of the Caliphate, the ones who had been defeated by Ali in the Battle of the Camel, the Abdullah, the Omar groups, who were Sunnis, but were also very pious Muslims too. So there's a whole range of people who were against the Umayyads, and that discontent was fermenting and fermenting and fermenting from the 780s on into from the 680s on into the 740s. As one Umayyad caliph succeeded another, and they grew weaker and weaker. And the empire was more out of control and more out of control. Well, there were a lot of revolts down in Arabia proper. That was a hotbed of revolt because of the pious feeling down there. And one of the revolts was put down by this famous Umayyad civil servant, had been a school teacher in Mecca. His name was Al-Hajjaj. He'd been a school teacher in Mecca, but he became I guess as a school teacher, learned how to be stern, like me. I'm stern. Maybe I could put down revolts. I doubt it. And he was able to put down revolts of disaffected groups, Harjis and others in the Mecca area. One of these revolt situations resulted in the taking of the stone, the black stone, away from the Kaaba and it being broken at that time, as I told you, because of people dragging it away and then dragging it back and fighting over it and things like that. And Hajjaj became a really seriously repressive governor for the Umayyads, a very successful one. They finally put him in control of all the Umayyad armies in Iraq, and he put down rebellion in Iraq. And finally, he was the general that took them all the way to India, made the conquests in 710 in India. So it's an illustrious career. I just mentioned him in passing as a representative of the kind of civil servant, military commander that grew up under the Umayyads. And when we do Islamic law, I'm going to also show you how the principles of Islamic law started to take hold in the Umayyad period too. What we ultimately end up calling Sharia. Now you have some textbooks. Keep up with me in your textbooks. If you have the Give book, start reading about Sharia. He has a lot of chapters about the Hadith and things like that. If you're reading Bernard Lewis, The Arabs in History, read about the caliphates. Get another view than mine. Mine isn't the only view. But if you have another book besides those books, any book will do. Just get some more views. That will give you a balance if you think I'm imbalanced. do read, and everything you read will widen your perspective. So I don't have the book in front of me. Anyone got a book? I'll tell you what is relevant. You know, if you have a book, show it to me, and I'll tell you. You have one with you? Yeah, pull it out. I'll tell you what would be relevant in that given book to what we're talking about now. Oh, here. Arabs in history. I look at the index. You find anything good in this book? It's superficial, but it's good enough. This guy advises the American government now. He's at Princeton. He advised them. He was a good friend of Chalabi. He advised Bush to attack Iraq. Arabia before Islam, yeah, we did that. Muhammad and the rise of Islam, we did that. The age of the conquest, we're doing that. The Arab kingdom, that's the Umayyad kingdom, we're doing that. The Islamic empire, we're doing that, which will be the Abbasid empire. So actually, the first 6 chapters right there. And under Islamic civilization will be all the other things that we're doing. So, you know, the first 8 chapters or so, he's even got one, I think, yeah. The Arabs in Europe, 7, we're probably doing that. That'll be mostly Spain and stuff. So actually, we're doing most of what he got in that book, just in different order. And the Give book, I think the Give book is better than that. What book have you got there? That Give?
Conquest. I think you're going to use that.
That's the Arabs in history. No, that's a different one. That's cultural. We're going to do that at the end. There's a Give book, Mohammedanism, which is really a good, tells about the 5 pillars of Islam, tells about the different schools of Islamic law. It's quite a good book. I think it's the best of the 3 books. Anyway, let's move on. So when the revolt finally did break out with all this disaffection, it actually was not under the family of Ali, because there were too many really enemies of Ali to make that a successful proposition. It came out under an obscure uncle of the Prophet known as Abbas. Now, we don't even know that he was a very good Muslim to begin with. We don't know when he came into Islam. We've heard of several uncles of the Prophet. We've heard of Abu Talib. We've heard of Abu Lahab. And now we have another one, Abbas. And his name is not recorded in early Islam hardly at all. But that was a convenient banner to unify all the disaffected groups. The disaffected Arabs, the disaffected people from the Arabian Peninsula, the disaffected supporters of Ali, all the groups. And the banner was the family of the Prophet. Because Abbas is a family of the Prophet, but he's not a, Ali line per se. So under the banner of the family of the Prophet, not the son of the Prophet, or the son-in-law of the Prophet, or the direct descendants of the Prophet, but just a more general heading, the family of the Prophet. And as I said, I don't think Abbas was even a very good Muslim. It was a successful way to bring all the disaffected groups against the Umayyads into one contingent. I should mention one other name before I move on to there, and that's this Abdul Malik here. The other famous Umayyad caliph was Abdul Malik. He was the height of the Marwanid group. He was around 710, 711, that period of there. 716 maybe. Maybe it was 7 or 8 years that he reigned, but that was really the height of the Umayyad period, and he did all the great architectural work. He built the Umayyad mosque in Damascus. He built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was an Umayyad mosque, the Dome of the Rock. And he built a beautiful palace in Jericho, which you can still go to visit today. And Abdul Malik was really, interested in cultural things, and distinguished himself for these kind of architectural and other fine cultural trappings of the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyads, as I told you, were Arab tastes, so they liked poetry, they liked singing, they liked hunting and all those sorts of things. And they also liked fine palaces, and they liked, calligraphy, and all the things that an Arab chieftain would even like today. In any case, these forces were organized under a more stern banner of the family of the Prophet, and the revolt, actually, when it happened, broke out in eastern part of the empire. It broke out, funnily enough, in Persia. In the eastern part of Persia, that even today is a very stern area of Persia, very deep Muslim. It's Khorasan is not an area you go into without, even when I traveled across Persia when I was young, your age, and hitchhiked across Persia back in the 60s, Khorasan was a place you stayed away from. It was really a very extremely pious area. In any case, the individual who raised this banner of revolt on the part of the Abbas and the Abbasids, made propaganda for them, came from out there. So it even had a Persian olive feel to it, even though it wasn't really a Persian olive group. I can't remember his name, but I think his name was Abu Muslim. But in any case, that may have been the name of one of the legal compilations. In any case, he had been a convert to Islam, and I think his family had formerly been Buddhist priests when he was in previous generations. But he was he did the propaganda for them, and the revolt swept westwards from east. It broke out in 747, and by 748, 49, it had reached Damascus. It was so violent that the Umayyad graves were even ripped out of their, earthly sepulchres and overturned and thrown away. Everything Umayyad was stamped out. It was a very harsh revolt. And there were two brothers who were the descendants of this Abbas. Abbas had died long ago. This would be third, maybe fourth generation after him. One was, I think, called Ja'far, and the other was called Al-Mansur. That was his nickname, the Conqueror, I think that would be something. These would be the new groups under the banner of Abbas, who was the uncle of the Prophet, and therefore they called themselves the Abbasids. And I said, I think their leader, the one who made the propaganda, was called Abu Musa, which was a convert name. He would have been a Persian convert. Originally, you see those statues they blew up in Afghanistan. Buddhism had come this far. Originally a Buddhist, person of Buddhist background. So this was a revolt against Arabism in a way. It was a revolt on the part of the oppressed peoples of the empire, not a part of the Arab glory of the empire. It was a group to be more Islamic, treat everyone more equal. That's why the Abbasids are usually known as the Islamic Caliphate, not the Arab Caliphate. And the capital was changed. They changed the capital to a place that didn't exist yet, Baghdad. Now we all know it quite well, but it hadn't existed at that time. They built it from the stones of the former Persian capital, which was not far away, called Ctesiphon. And Baghdad was a round city, built according to modern architectural standards of that time. A very modern, forward-looking city that was purposely built as a capital. Didn't exist before. If it did, it was just a little village. And they built it out of the ruins of this Persian capital that was not far away. And it became the fabled center of the Abbasid Empire from around the 750-51 period until the collapse of the Abbasid Empire. How many years later? I think around 1257. So this center of Arab Islamic civilization lasted for 500 years. Who destroyed it? The Mongols destroyed it. Wiped it out totally. Exterminated everybody in it. Leveled it to the ground. Because the Mongols, when they came, didn't mess about. They followed a scorched earth policy, and terror and the fear of them was part of the policy to intimidate everyone who was in front of them and make them realize that there was no point to resist Mongol expansion. And we hear about the Mongols in Europe, but the Mongols were most devastating to the Middle East. They were finally stopped in Palestine. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll cover this next time. I will cover it next time. At a battle called Ain Jalut, not far from the Sea of Galilee. A lot of battles were fought in Palestine by the Mamluks. And I'll tell you about the Mamluks next time. I'm going to continue this history up to the present next time. So then we'll move over to cultural subjects after I finish the history. But it's a great history. I mean, you see how romantic and exciting it is. And anyone who studies Islam should do it. Did you do this in your previous Islamic course, the history? No. Anyone who does the history, anyone who does Islam should, of course, do the history. It's a really exciting history, and it fills everything in properly for people. As you see, I mean, I have it in my head for some unknown reason. I don't know how it got there, but I think because of my oral exams when I was a PhD student, my professors made me read Arab and Islamic history, so I read everything that there was. So I learned it, and then when I came to Cal State Long Beach, I taught it. But it stayed in my brain, so it's just a lot of other things that doesn't stay in my brain. My wife says, you can't remember what I was wearing on such and such night 25 years ago. You don't even remember what we ate, blah, blah, blah. No, I said, I haven't got a clue. I can't remember anything. I don't remember what anyone looks like. I don't remember anything you ate. I don't remember what dress you were wearing. I don't know anything about anything, but I can remember history. I know all history I ever studied. So some people have some brain that remember some things. My wife can remember exactly what people said at a dinner party 35 years ago. She knows exactly what clothing they were wearing. She knows how they parted their hair. Is that how you women feel? Are you able to do that? I don't know. I can't do it, that's for sure. I don't know how the men feel in this room, but all I can remember is history. That's the only thing I can remember. I don't know anything else. Okay. And history of everything. I can do the American history for you. I can do the Jewish history. I can do the Christian history. I can do whatever you want, you name it. As I said, this Roman thing on television at the moment, I told you last time, is pretty good, and you might want to watch it because it's a soap opera that takes place against the background of Roman history, and the Roman history is pretty accurate. It's on HBO. It's a 10 or 12 part series. I do recommend it, not for the soft porn in it, and which is, I guess, as Baudelaire said, we've included a little bit of pornography to please the gentlemen of the press. Well, they've included a bit to please, titillate you readers. But there was a lot of pornography in Rome at that time, so it probably can be considered accurate. But they have a kind of melodrama against the background of the history of Caesar, his rise to power, his assassination, and the rise of his successors, Mark Antony, Octavius, Brutus, Cleopatra, and so on. So it's actually pretty, and it's not only about them. It centers around the common people who make up their armies. They're the focus of it, and it's good of upstairs, downstairs, with soap opera, porn, Roman style. But the history is strong. History is so far pretty accurate, the general history. I know the guy who wrote it, so in fact I know that he cares about history. He's a former Marine, and he wrote the script to Patton, so since he wrote the script to Patton, he's a guy that cares about history. He would not, he also wrote the script to, what's that movie Coppola made about the Vietnam War, where they go up the heart of darkness. What's the name of that movie?
Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, he wrote the script to Apocalypse Now, too. So the guy who wrote the script and created this thing is he's pretty accurate sort of historical. He knows how to put melodrama into it, too. Anyway, let's go back to the Baghdad. The Abbasids come to power. Abu Muslim, he gets paid off like all good servants get paid off. They execute him because they don't want any rivals, and he's considered a threat because he was too successful. So when you serve powerful people and you do things for them, like the Bush family, don't be surprised if in the end you end up on the scrap heap, like poor Scooter Libby who's going to end up. Because great families do not feel gratitude towards people who help them get where they are, because they're too much of a competition and threat for them. And this is all through Islamic history we're going to find this problem of propagandists who help families rise not being given a lot of credit and honor thereafter. So there's a romantic story attached to all this. As the Abbasid army sweep into Syria, all the Umayyads are killed with their families and everybody else, but one Umayyad prince escapes. He's just a young boy. I don't know how old he is. He's maybe the same age Muawiyah was when he came up with his brother, but it's a romantic story. He's an Umayyad prince. His name is Arberry. He has a freedman who helps him too, called Badr. I don't know if he'll get the same bad treatment that all these other freedmen get, from Musa ibn Nusayr to Tariq to Abu Muslim to others. But I think Badr gets something of the same treatment in the end. In any case, Badr is older, obviously. This is a young boy, and he's got protection of these two brothers, Abdurrahman and his younger brother, and they're crossing the Euphrates or one of the rivers to escape from the Abbasid police, as the Abbasid are wiping everyone out. And Abdurrahman and Badr swim across the river, but the brother is younger brother is too weak to do that, and they watch him killed on the other shore. It's a very romantic story. Anyway, the mother of this prince was actually a Berber woman from North Africa. So they are able, through his Berber connections, to smuggle him across North Africa. And suddenly, out of the blue, in around 755, he's all now grown up, he appears in Spain. And the Spanish tribes have been very disaffected because they're mostly Arab, and they're very Umayyad oriented, and they're very pro-Arab, and they're Arab-type ethos, not so much Muslim-type ethos. But they're feuding with each other over this Qais Qalb issue. And into the midst of all this, Badr and his other friends and the Berber groups that protected this boy introduce Abdurrahman. And the tribes in Spain are overjoyed. The Umayyad Empire has come back to life, and they proclaim Abdurrahman their caliph. And the forces in Baghdad, the Abbasid forces in Baghdad, are far too far away to do anything about it. So the first piece of the Islamic Empire falls away because of the problems of administration here. Again, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention one other little fine point of history that preceded this, because all this is a huge tapestry, as you see. You try to fill it in chronological order. But in the conquest of Spain prior to that, the Muslim armies did get to northern Spain. So they left that area here, but they also crossed the Pyrenees. And they actually moved into the Riviera area here, the mountains of the Riviera. In the 800s, there were Muslim armies even in Switzerland blocking the passes. And one of these columns went up into France. And that will be the furthest north the Muslim advance went. And in 732, they were stopped in a field between the town of Tours and Poitiers. It's now called the Battle of Poitiers, but then it was called the Battle of Tours, by a group of French knights under a person called Charles Martel. Charles the Hammerer. And he's a local French noble official over one of the local kings. I don't know the whole story of that. But ultimately, Charles Martel, as you know, becomes the father of Charlemagne. And Charlemagne becomes the great Holy Roman Empire, Emperor II in the 800s. That is the second empire, Roman Empire under Charlemagne, that becomes the empire in the in the 800s, rivaling the Muslims in the West. But that's the fabled event of the Christians supposedly defeating the Muslims in France. Actually, the stories of the battles in the Pyrenees and all the warfare that went on in the border areas, if you've been to those areas, I've been down there. There are huge forts in the Pyrenees Mountains. It's an incredible sight to see some of these places. Are in all the French legends, like the English have the King Arthur stories, the French have Roland and Ronaldo and all their knights, and what they're doing is fighting the Saracens in the Pyrenees. And there's a huge poem, I don't know if you've ever heard of, called The Song of Roland, which is about how the rear guard is massacred of the French army by the Muslims coming north, and Roland has this horn that he blows to bring his reinforcements. I don't remember the whole story. It's called the Battle of Roncesvalles or something that this massacre takes place at. Anyway, it's part of French mythology and song and story of the 700-800 period, and it rivals the King Arthur stories. Just to call your attention to that. But the 732 is an interesting date because Gibbon, in his famous book, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. What's this got to do with the rise and fall of the Roman Empire? I don't know. I didn't read the whole book, I have to admit. But he said at one point, if the brave Christian knights had not withstood the Saracen charge at the field of Tours, we would today be hearing the sound of the minaret from the towers of Oxford. Guess what? Today they are hearing the sounds of the minaret from the towers of Oxford. There are mosques in Oxford, and I've seen them and heard them. But the fact of the matter is, this is part of the lore of Christian culture. They think that that battle stopped the Muslim advance. I don't think that battle really stopped the Muslim advance. The Muslim advance really petered out. That was one of the engagements that illustrated the fact of its petering out. It couldn't continue. It didn't have the supplies, it didn't have the communication lines, it didn't have the wherewithal, it was overextended as it was. And that was just a small engagement, but the Christians make a lot of it. That there they stopped. And I don't know how many have heard of that battle in their history classes in high school. Usually they make a fuss about that battle. Yeah, it was something, but I don't. It was just a scouting party of Muslim soldiers anyway that were, stopped on that particular battlefield by the so-called brave Frankish knights or whatever you want to call them. So I'm not sure. And the Muslims did extend their influence into the paths of the Pyrenees, and they made the Mediterranean what would be considered a Muslim lake, as it was called. There was a famous Belgian historian. Why would he be interested in this? Henri Pirenne. It's called the Pirenne Thesis. He wrote a book called Muhammad and Charlemagne. Charlemagne being the son of Charles Martel. And his thesis was that it was the conquest of the Mediterranean by the Muslims that moved European civilization to the north. And of course, coming from Belgium, he would like a thesis like that because he's in Northern Europe. But I just let it make sense, because he says that commerce was interrupted even between Italy and Northern Europe because of the outposts. There's Muslim place names in the Alps where contingents hung out. They moved from the Riviera up into the Alps. They interrupted commerce in the 800s. They raided the Italian seacoast. Corsairs would raid the Italian seacoast. It really completed so-called Dark Ages in Europe. So any civilization in Europe moved north of Switzerland, north of France, into England, into Germany, into the northern countries of Europe. That was his thesis. And by the way, there the power of Europe has remained. Do I think that thesis has a lot of truth to it? Yeah, I think he's probably right. It was the closing of the Mediterranean by the Muslim conquest that drove European civilization northwards, where, previously it had always been in the south, hadn't it? Everything had been in Rome, and Spain, and Greece, and so on. After that, it was always Switzerland north, Germany, England, Holland, the Scandinavian countries, and so on. Nothing south anymore. Northern France, and so on. In any case, as you see, in this 755 period, where the tribes, Qais tribes in Spain, elected Abd al-Rahman their caliph, and he became Abd al-Rahman I in Spain, the first piece of the great empire fell away. And over the succeeding period of time, other pieces fell away. In 800, Morocco fell away under another local governor who had made himself a dynasty. And after his name was Aghlab, so they were called the Aghlabids. Others in Tunis fell away. What's present-day Tunis? They were called the Fatimids. So you have the Aghlabids in Morocco in the 800s. In Tunis in the 900s, you have the Fatimids. Then the Fatimids, I'll cover this next time, come east to Egypt, conquer Egypt. Commemorate their conquests by naming the capital city of Egypt Al-Kahir. Al-Kahir means triumphant. It's the triumph of a Fatimid takeover of Egypt in the 900s, which was destroyed by the Crusaders in the 1100s and ultimately gave way to Salah ad-Din, the conqueror of the Crusaders in the 1100 periods in his dynasty. But the Fatimids were very strong in Egypt from around 950, 960 onwards. Why are the Fatimids called the Fatimids? Because they have a pretension. What is their pretension? The name tells it to you all. Who do they have a pretension that they're descended from? The Prophet's family through Fatima, his only daughter, which is why they call themselves Fatimids. So it's a Shiite dynasty in the center of North Africa. The Iraq-Baghdad area was not strong enough to withstand this piecemeal decomposition of its empire by local governors and other people with, causes to claim. So one of the things were finally said and done. By the time the Crusaders came there in the 1000s and 1100s, the empire had been restricted really to basically Syria, Palestine, and Iraq. And even in the east, the eastern parts, Persia fell away in the 800s to a dynasty called the Buyids. Again, a military dynasty that took over, and they were a Shiite dynasty in Persia. The Shiites were getting the upper hand. They even took Baghdad in the 900s, but they left the caliph, the Abbasid caliph, in control there as a figurehead, and he was backed up by Buyid. I'll cover this more next time. Buyid forces. So there were Shiites propping up the Sunni caliph just for appearance sake. And he lived on like that. So basically, by the time the Mongols came, the caliph only had control of Baghdad and areas of Iraq. He had no control of almost anything else. They kept him mostly as a figurehead, and the Mongols executed. But that was the end of the caliphate that bin Laden wants to restore, this great caliphate, supposedly, that never existed, as you see, except for moments. In any event, it fell apart almost as soon as it was created. I'm not criticizing, I'm just stating a fact. So this is just to give you the sweep of what occurred here. So at one point in the Islamic world, when the Fatimids were in control of Egypt, and the Umayyads were in control of Spain, and the Abbasids were in control of Iraq and the neighboring countries, you had three competing caliphates, side by side, operating at the same time. One, an Umayyad caliphate in Spain, two, an Abbasid caliphate in Iraq, and three, a Shiite caliphate in Egypt. This was around the period, I would say, when this occurred would be from around the late 900s to the fall of the Fatimid dynasty in the beginning of the 1200s. If you want to know what happened to after the Fatimids, I'll tell you next time, but it's the Mamluks. The Mamluks are a slave dynasty. M-A-M-L-U-K-S. And they continue all the way up to the Turks. So around the 1250s, the Mamluks take over. They go all the way up to the 1600s and the coming of the Turks, 1500s really, 1600s. And the Turks come, the Ottomans, but the Ottomans don't suppress them. And finally, it's Napoleon in the 1900s that fights the Mamluks in Egypt, the Battle of the Pyramids, and finishes off that dynasty. They operate under as a lesser dynasty under the Ottomans later, but I'll fill in all that next time. Just show you the scope of this history is vast. It really is vast. But from about middle 900s to early 1200s, 3 caliphates operating at the same time, all considering themselves Orthodox. Abbasid in Iraq, Umayyad in Spain, and Fatimid in Egypt. I'll pick up there next time.
Did you give
I did, but I forgot to bring him today. I'll have to bring him next time. I'm sorry about it.